Hello, my name is Professor Anthony Reddie. I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture that's based at Regent's Park College, that's part of Oxford University. I'm also an extraordinary professor of theological ethics at the University of South Africa. And so the title of my talk is Not Returning to Normal. Not Returning to Normal. And really what I want to do in the next 15 or so minutes is really to look at the intersectionality of systemic racism that we've seen since the death of George Floyd, or at least it has been revealed in greater focus for us in terms of the death of George Floyd, and that on the back of the coronavirus pandemic. And what I want to suggest is that what those two things have laid bare is, I guess, what many of us have known for a long time, that we live in a skewed, racist, systemic system of injustice that has existed for several centuries. And the worst thing about it is that it's been constructed in a way that has, I guess, convinced many of us to almost be complicit in it, under the aegis that somehow this is not only normal, it's the best it can be. In actual fact, the worst heresy of all is that somehow this is of God. And I think what this pandemic is showing us, what this particular set of circumstances is showing us at the moment, is that what was normal was never good. And therefore, whatever happens on the other side of this pandemic, and I have many gifts, but one of them is not possessing a crystal ball and being able to second guess what we think is going to happen. So I don't know. I think it's the great Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard who was reputed to have said that life is lived forwards but understood backwards. And so really the truth is it will be the historians and various other people who are trained to look back at events and to determine how significant this particular moment has been. I don't have that gift. And therefore, for me, I can't tell you what the other side of the pandemic will look like. But what I do hope, my prayer is, that there will be a resistance to any attempt to return us to the old model of normality. Because that model was a flawed one. It was a deeply skewed one. It's one that has been in the making and development for 5 centuries around the basis of global capitalism and its collision with the exploitation of black and brown bodies and the resources from the global south. It's very much a product of empire. And sadly, Christianity is colluded with empire for so long that we have become enmeshed within it. And as I said, I think the heresy has been that somehow this global capitalistic system then becomes almost synonymous with our understanding of what we might mean by God's economy, or in more traditional language, like the kingdom of God. This is not the kingdom, and I'll come back to that in a moment in terms of a particular post-colonial rereading of a biblical text that I think hopefully gives us some theological ammunition for resisting the temptation to believe that this is normal and there should be a return to the old order. But first, let me start with a story, or at least an anecdote that is told by one of my heroes, a white Methodist bishop, radical white Methodist bishop called Peter Story, who in the years of apartheid in South Africa was one of the few white people, or few white leaders in Christian circles who was a vociferous opponent of apartheid and the legalization of white supremacy. And so Story tells this, and so Peter Story tells this story of a mythical couple who agreed to go on holiday together. Now, this is the days before mobile phones. That's the important point you need to understand in terms of this story being told. So, first couple go on holiday, and each going to spend 2 weeks. So the first couple go out together, And they go to this apartment that they've booked. They've never been there before. The brochures look fantastic. They arrive. When they arrive, much to their horror, they find out that their resort is located next to a pig farm. And the smell is awful. They are just astounded by it. It's gut-wrenching. They're just racked with anger at the situation they're in. So the husband wants to leave immediately. The wife is more pragmatic. She says, honey, be like, we've paid our money, we're here now, we've got to make the best of it. So they struggle on, dealing with the smell of this resort. After a week, as arranged, the second couple come and join them. And so the second couple come, and they come to the resort, and of course they are met with the same situation, this awful stench. And so the second couple goes to the first and they say, how on earth have you put up with this smell for this whole week? And the first couple turn to the second one and they go, smell, what smell? And story tells that anecdote to say, well, that was a situation of many white South Africans in the years prior to 1994. That what was happening was in the country you had this palpable stench of racism and white supremacy and the economic exploitation of black and brown bodies. But most white people have become so habituated to it, they didn't see the smell. Nothing touched them. It was normal. It was almost as if like they were in this collective act of holding metaphorical pegs to noses in order to somehow just to ignore the fact that around them was this awful stench of injustice. And Story says, well, if enough people are convinced that there is no smell or that smell is livable and you're happy to continue normality within it, then of course it continues and no one complains about it. It's the other way of talking about the proverbial elephant in the room. I borrow Story's anecdotes in order to say that that's essentially what we have been living with for the past hundreds of years. That there has been this smell, not just within South Africa. South Africa's only crime was simply to legalize and to use the judiciary and various other formal sanctions in order to affect what effectively happens in many white majority countries in the global north across the world. So actually, if you look at the indices in terms of the imbalance between, let's say, white middle class and black working class in Britain, in terms of where people live, terms of life expectancy, terms of issues of social mobility, actually we're not much better than South Africa, even during the years of apartheid. So therefore, what that tells us is that this systemic form of injustice isn't new. It's been around for a long time. So therefore, the first thing I want to say is that whilst I'm grateful for the sudden attention that has been garnered around the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, whilst I'm certainly grateful for the greater attention that many white people are giving in terms of trying to be allies to challenge this question of racism. I am grateful for that. I've had more conversations about race with a variety of people in the last 6 months than I have had in the previous 20 years. Seriously. I'm grateful for that. But of course, it then does beg the question, why did people not see this for so long? Why is it that there was this stench and most people could just simply maneuver their way around it and pretend that not that this was normal, but actually it was a state of being that was almost preferable? That somehow this was normality and it was okay and it was the best that we could manage. I mean, how could you even conceive of that? Racism did not start with the death of George Floyd. Black people have been dying at the hands of white power for a long time. The first march I ever went on was in April 1987, final year of my degree course at Birmingham University. And a guy called Clinton McKirbin, he was a young African Caribbean man in his early 20s, had gone into a shop and had been alleged that he was using a stolen credit card. And the owner called for the police, and as McKirbin tried to leave very quickly, he had to be confronted by two police officers who were on the beat in Wolverhampton, walking past a shop. They both detained him. He was a large guy. He then tried to resist. They called for backup, and they ended up with 5 or 6 police officers pinning his body to the floor, and one of them having the weight of his body on Clinton McKerbin's neck, and he died of asphyxiation. And there was a massive march in Wolverhampton. First time I'd ever been on a demonstration. I come from a very, very socially conservative, theologically conservative Methodist family, where everything was very much about a sense of responsibility politics. So don't get into trouble, work hard, be dutiful, love God, stay out of trouble, stay out of mischief, and everything will be okay. Racism only happens to people who behave badly and are transgressive. So when I told my parents I was going on a march, they were horrified. They were saying, it's nothing to do with you. This Clinton McKerbin guy had a stolen credit card, allegedly. Somehow that meant that he kind of deserved to die. Never quite understood that. But I went on the march. What struck me at the time was that most white people remained utterly untouched by it. So when I raised that issue within my student cohort at Birmingham University and asked if they would go on a march with me, they were not interested. So we were interested, certainly within the student Christian movement, of talking about apartheid and being in solidarity with Black South Africans being oppressed in South Africa. But when I asked those same white people to go on a march with me to Wolverhampton against police brutality, they were not interested, because somehow that did not happen in nice, polite, middle-class England, Middle England. Didn't happen over here. And so consequently, there was an air of normality whereby the march was largely black people, hardly any white people down there, and the police officers were never charged. And Clinton McKerbin's death was described by the coroner as I'm not sure if it was death by misadventure, but whatever it was, no one was ever charged. So what will happen in this particular moment is it's the equivalent of suddenly people waking up and realize that there is a stench. And the stench cannot be dodged. It's here. It's with us. It's been with us for a long time. And as I said, I'm grateful that people have belatedly woken up to the fact that this is what's going on. But at least now, no one is in any doubt that there is such a thing as systemic racism that blights the lives of ordinary people. That when we had the riots in Britain in the early 80s, in many of our large conurbations, and the government had a report, Lord Scammer's report. Scammer's report said there was nothing to do with racism, it was to do with poverty and deprivation. Policy and deprivation. So therefore, if we sent Michael Heseltine and various task forces to throw money into the city and create more opportunities and to create more gainful ways of keeping people off the street, then that somehow would solve the problem, because it did solve the problem, because the problem wasn't just deprivation. It was actually systemic racism. At least now, post the McPherson report, we now have a sense of the existence of systemic racism. But what COVID-19 that foreshadowed the death of George Floyd is, now we're in a context where we can't pretend that we don't know. It is here. And the world has it's revealed its hand, that it's a skewed system that leaves particular groups of people vulnerable to death because of the economic circumstances in which they find themselves, in terms of poor housing, in terms of jobs for which you can't socially isolate, in terms of a vulnerability to a virus that kills people not through genetics, but actually largely through what postcode you, or in America, what zip code you live in. It's no accident that people in inner cities like New York have died in disproportionate numbers compared to people in the sort of vanilla, fudged-looking suburbs. This brings me to the final point, which is really some of my theological reflections around what I think is a theology of resistance to this normalization of injustice and evil. I want to look in terms of Matthew's account of parable of the talents. I think it's Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30. And all of us know the story, so I'm not gonna go over and rehearse it. It's a master has 3 servants, and he gives them a proportion of money and sends them out to do his bidding. And the first one does exactly what the master wants and gets rewarded. Comes back and makes the master a profit. Second one does moderately well, but not as well as the first one. The third one, of course, in most of our traditional readings, is a villain. So the third one comes back and says, "Well, actually, master, I know you're a hard man, and you've taken what wasn't yours. You've exploited other people, so I was scared of getting it wrong. So I got your money, stuck it in a hole, dusted it off, given you it back. You are no worse off." That's the thing you have to remember. The third person doesn't steal from the master. He simply gives back the master that which is the master's. The master says, "Oh, it's terrible. How could you do this? If you know you're going to do it, you should have put it in the bank and still made me even a modest profit." And it's interesting how the punishment is utterly disproportionate to the so-called crime. So basically, by not giving the master a profit, he's taken away and thrown into everlasting darkness with so-called gnashing of teeth. That's a punishment for simply not making the master profit. And the worst thing about that is that we have been told to read that as if somehow the master is analogous to God. Now, here's the thing about that passage. When the third servant is making the clear accusations to the master about his character, about the fact that he's greedy and he's repressive and he's cruel and people are scared of him, the master never refutes it. He never says, "Well, how dare you say that, because everyone knows I'm kind and generous." He says, "Well, actually, if you knew that and if that's the truth, then why then did you put my money on deposit so I can make some money?" And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, at what point in this development, the hermeneutic, the interpretation of this passage, were we conned into believing that someone who was cruel, not forgiving, not generous, is somehow linked to God, that this is a God figure, and somehow this story is somehow normative of how God responds to us in terms of resources, in terms of treatment, in terms of agency, in terms of how we are treated, in terms of our conduct. How do we even get to that? Especially when, and this is the bit that I've never forgotten, even when I was a kid in Sunday school, and this was when the story was told to me in Sunday school, I remember thinking to myself, this can't be right. Because at some point, right at the end, I had the text in front of me, it says these words: "To those that have, more will be given. And to those who have little, even the little they have will be taken from them." And I thought to myself, that can't be right. So those that have, more will be given. And in the little they have for the others, it will be taken off them, even the little they have. Now, of course, the way in which we've always squared this is to think of that in terms of the talents is really about spiritual gifts. And those who have gifts, more gifts will be given than those who have in the little gift, if they squander it, will be taken off them. I think most post-colonial scholars, my favourite one being Theology, has written a lot of work about post-colonial critique of the scriptures, says that is nonsense. Actually, another way of reading this text is to see this as an allegory. It is a political critique of an existing system. It's important to remind ourselves that Jesus' whole ministry is against a backdrop of empire, Roman imperialism. And part of the danger of ourselves, our sconce in Britain, country that had the biggest empire the world has ever seen, at its peak, 24% of the world, is this sense in which we read the scriptures and we assume that we identify with the Jesus movement. And these Romans are terrible imperialists with whom we have nothing in common. When the fact is, Britain is the Romans. Corporate America is the Romans. Globalization and the power of it are the Romans. We are not the Jesus movement. The Church of England is not the Jesus movement. Neither is the Methodist Church by any means. We have consorted with and been in bed with empire. We are the Romans. And so Jesus' ministry, against a backdrop of first century colonialism in Judea, is this central question of how then do you proclaim the kingdom whilst in the midst of Babylon, in the midst of a rapacious empire that is seeking to despoil lives, to grab resources, to centralize everything around Rome, and to limit the agency of ordinary people, to turn them into vassals, turn them into puppets. How do you resist? And I think It's not just myself, I think a number of scholars have said this. There's a fantastic counter reading that comes from William Hertzog II in his book, The Parables as Subversive Speech. A number of people looked at this text and said, actually, what you have here is a form of divine irony. That what Jesus is offering is a critique on first century colonialism. So the master isn't God. That's the bit. If you remember nothing else, it's this. The master is not God. This globalized system is not the kingdom. It's not the normality that God wants us to live for and to bear witness to as followers of Christ. The master is cruel, is greedy, is rapacious. He says so. And the honesty of the third servant is the ability to name it and not to collude. So the first two, I'm not going to criticize them. They know what they need to do and they play the game. And certainly if we had more time and if I was doing this as an experiential exercise, which is how I like to work, if we were doing this in embodied context, we'd get people into groups and I would ask those who are playing the part of the first two if they love the master. And most say they don't, but they're doing what they need to do because they know the game. They've been given the resources in order to make money for the master, and they do it, and they do it willingly. But it doesn't mean that they necessarily enjoy it. It just means that they understand what needs to be done in order to survive. The third one, the so-called villain of the piece, as we've been taught to read this, is the most honest one and says, actually, I'm not playing this game. I know you're a hypocrite. I'm going to stick it in the ground. I'm going to dust it off and give it back to you. I've not cheated you. You've got back which you gave me. But of course, the problem is, in a system that is steeped around the greed of the master, that's not enough. The master has to make a profit. So the third one is the one who is resisting and says, actually, I'm not going to play this game. I'm not going to do your bidding. I'm not going to allow you to pass this off as somehow a normal and an acceptable state of affairs when we all know what a crook you are and how the system is loaded against us. Even the fact that third one gets less resources to start with is still problematic. Who decides that? Only the master does, and we have to read the story and assume that the master's been fair and the master is behaving in an appropriate way to those three servants. So, in conclusion, what I want to suggest is that we have to be that third servant. We have to be the one that says, actually, we're not going to allow this system to go uncommented on. We're not going to allow the attempt to push us back into an old normal that was rapacious, greedy, and had many people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. People, white and black, and from a whole variety of different ethnic and cultural groups being exploited and then being told that it was their fault. So programs like Benefit Street and there's the propaganda that seemed to demonize the poor. Interesting, I've always said this and apologize again, how we have the language for the undeserving poor, but never the language for the undeserving rich. So we have to resist a return to the old normal. We have to fight for values of the kingdom that will be about justice and equity for all people. And we need the courage to be unpopular and to be demonized as a third servant who simply says, I'm not going to play this skewed game again. Thank you very much. Apologies for going on slightly longer than intended. I'll get a bit passionate about these kinds of things. Thank you very much.